Asanna눔 Foundation, we support entrepreneurs and strive to build a culture where succeed is shared. As we told in the introduction slides of our foundation. So in our foundation, we think it's important for who have been benefited can pay it forward to the next generation. So many of our participants, whether they're entrepreneurs or social innovators or startup representative, share the same desires to give in a way that are thoughtful, impactful, and sustainable. So that's why this first session is designed to broaden our understanding of philanthropic cultures and models. So Micah will talk about mid-century risk capital foundation to today's participatory funds and Silicon Valley's entrepreneur givings, and using the examples such as the Rosenberg Foundation or the Vanguard Foundation and venture philanthropy. So I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Micah McElroy, Associate Director of Research at Stanford PACS Effective Philanthropy Learning Initiative, whose work examines trust, power, and participation in philanthropy. So Professor Micah, the floor is all yours.
Look good to everybody?
Yeah, now I can see the slides. Great.
Excellent. Okay. All right. Great. And just the slides, no notes or anything. I've been known to make that mistake before.
Oh, I don't see any notes, so I think
Oh, great. Okay. You don't get to know all my secrets just yet. Okay. Excellent. Yeah, well, thank you for the welcome. Very glad to be here with all of you. I may not speak as much about Rosenberg and Vanguard in my lecture because I chose to make a last minute decision given some of the recent events and focus a lot more on Silicon Valley for my lecture. I think there's a lot to still talk about there, but I will also be happy in the Q&A to talk about some of these sort of earlier forms of philanthropy that preceded Silicon Valley. But to get a little bit of introduction to me, I think your Daniel, your introduction was great, but I guess good to start. Yes, my name is Micah. I am a researcher at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. Much of what I do is study how philanthropists think about and practice philanthropy with the goal of using those research insights to actually help people who are giving money away do so in a way that's not only effective, but also avoids unintended harm. And by training, I'm a historian, so you'll hear a lot about the past. And I do think that is a useful tool for people who want to think about how to achieve impact in their philanthropy or in many other endeavors. And today I'm going to be speaking with you about how entrepreneurs in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I'm located, became philanthropists, and what we can learn from their examples that may be relevant for some of the work that you're doing or for thinking about cultivating philanthropy elsewhere in the world. Before we begin, I just wanted to make a note about geography. So the San Francisco Bay Area, it's a big place, has a really long history of philanthropy, but we're going to be focusing on really this sub-region within the San Francisco Bay Area called Silicon Valley, and see it pictured here. This is a region that's often hard to define, especially lately. You know, is it a place? Is it an identity? But historically, it's had these geographic boundaries, and it's an area that is south of San Francisco and is associated with technology and innovative investment practices, Stanford University, of course, and also a lot of philanthropy. More often when people talk about Silicon Valley, they focus on, you know, the companies, they might study Silicon Valley to think about how can they foster the sort of innovative and highly profitable companies that have existed here and locate them elsewhere. So some of the examples that have come out of Silicon Valley that inspire a lot of research include Apple, Meta, Google, Intel, Adobe, Genentech, among many others. Silicon Valley just has like this long list of successful companies. And there's many people who want to see if they can try and bring Silicon Valley elsewhere to the world. But what is less studied and what we're really going to focus on is thinking about the region's philanthropy. which arguably also has significant social consequences, as well as a history that I think can prove really instructive for, I hope, many of you, and for those who want to think about how you can deepen commitments to philanthropy or work with entrepreneurial donors. Today, the region is just an epicenter of philanthropy. There's over 100 billionaires here, combined net worth of over $1 trillion, which makes, you know, Silicon Valley have a lot of financial capacity for philanthropy. And there's also a lot of ambition to use all that wealth in really transformative ways. So the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is pictured here at the top, which was founded by Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, have this commitment of, you know, using 99% of their Facebook shares to treat all diseases in their lifetime. And there are many others who you'll also learn about who want to harness private wealth to seek these really transformative, often very ambitious ends in very innovative ways. But I do want to note, and this is partly why I wanted to focus on Silicon Valley, even though the region I'm in now is associated with philanthropy and entrepreneurship, there's also been a lot more criticism of philanthropy here, including by entrepreneurs themselves. So in the last 2 or 3 years, some of the region's entrepreneurs have argued that philanthropy is actually not really capable of achieving meaningful change anymore. Some have even argued that philanthropy actually harms society by advancing ideas and interventions that perhaps obstruct innovation or the success of entrepreneurial companies. And you can see some examples here. Elon Musk describing how empathy is the fundamental weakness of Western culture. And these criticisms and changes have really elicited a lot of debate right now about what the meaning and value of philanthropy is in Silicon Valley. Some, including Elon Musk, who's co-founded Tesla, and Mark Andreessen, who's a prominent venture capitalist, have argued really that business itself is a form of philanthropy, and perhaps in its capacity to produce innovative technologies that can change society. Maybe it's even a more effective means of philanthropy than giving your money away. And at the same time, including most recently Melinda French Gates, who is the wife of Bill Gates, there's been a pushback against these arguments, and people claiming that Musk and Andreessen and these others who are arguing that business is a form of philanthropy aren't really even doing philanthropy anymore. All to say that we're in this moment where there's actually a lot of argument and debate amongst these really wealthy entrepreneurs about the fundamentals of philanthropy. You know, what is its purpose? How do you practice it? Is it producing new Tesla automobiles, or is it giving money away to launch some new innovative educational program? So part of what I want to do in this session with all of you is explain both how philanthropy developed in Silicon Valley and how it's become so fractured and contentious today, and what that might tell us about the task of cultivating philanthropy elsewhere in the world. All right. So our agenda then is to tackle these topics, which we're going to start off by thinking about really what is distinctive about Silicon Valley philanthropy, and how did the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs become philanthropists. And finally, we're going to think a bit about what some of the lessons could be from the story of Silicon Valley philanthropy. What might you want to emulate, and what might you want to be wary of? And hopefully have plenty of time for your questions. In order to understand, I think, what is distinctive about Silicon Valley philanthropy, we actually have to start much earlier, and not in the sort of sunny Silicon Valley, but really the far less comfortable factories and overcrowded cities of the 1890s in the other side of the United States, up in New York and Detroit. This is where modern philanthropy in the United States originates. This is a period in US history which one journalist described as being an era of progress and poverty, where there's this creation of immense new industrial corporations, new factories, novel technologies, and the growth of these immense transnational businesses and personal fortunes, as well as far more visible and durable poverty, many people working in unsafe working conditions for very low wages. There's a lot of discord and conflict between employers and workers. And this extreme inequality and instability provokes a lot of fears in the United States that the existing means of actually addressing social problems and allocating wealth aren't working anymore. And it's in this context where a small number of entrepreneurs introduce the idea of philanthropy as an answer to these problems. And, I should say that the United States has a really long history of people giving away resources, be it money or time, for broadly socially beneficial purposes. But what these entrepreneurs are arguing at the time is that philanthropy is a different and better mode of allocating wealth with much greater promise for improving society. So to make this a bit more concrete, Andrew Carnegie, who's pictured here with his distinctive beard, he is a steel industrialist, and he is perhaps one of the most vocal proponents of philanthropy in this 1890s period. His ideas continue to inspire philanthropists, including Bill Gates. And what Carnegie argues is that really what counts as charity or giving in the United States actually does very little to improve society. In fact, often what he argues is that when people give money away, they're actually making situations worse. So he believed, for example, that all too often people aren't really giving with a serious consideration of the consequences that their gifts might have on society. So in his famous essay, which is called The Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie argued that people might give money away to someone they encounter on the street, for example, and they might sympathize with that person and decide to give them money. But Carnegie argues that you don't know whether that person's actually going to use that money in a productive way. They might instead use that money to, I think his examples are buy alcohol or gamble. In other words, the giving that you're doing, and which he believes is very common, isn't really addressing the sort of conditions that make someone poor. It merely allows them to survive. And the goal of philanthropy, as Carnegie and others believe at this time, is really to actually transform the circumstances that cause social problems such as poverty. And the idea that they have is that if they can harness the expertise and practices that they've developed in accumulating their wealth, and apply those practices and ideas to how they allocate wealth in the form of philanthropy, they can achieve immense public benefits. So in practice, this means, using scientific evidence to identify promising causes and interventions, as well as creating organizations run by trusted advisors and academics who could do the challenging work of identifying worthy causes and recipients. And these organizations, which are called foundations, resembled in many ways the industrial corporations from which these entrepreneurs had made their wealth. And that was intentional. Foundations were run just as their corporations were run by managers who were entrusted with the task of allocating wealth on behalf of the donor with the belief that they could do so far more effectively than the donor by himself could ever do, right? A donor by themselves can only make small scattered donations, whereas if you hire managers and professionals, they can identify much more promising interventions and allocate wealth at a much larger and more rapid scale. And we'll see that this is actually a recurrent dynamic in philanthropy. A lot of what is defined as philanthropy changes across time in the United States, but is very often defined by the business experience of entrepreneurs. So in this case, the reference point is the industrial corporation of the 1890s, early 1900s. However, it's worth noting that whatever their intentions, people like Andrew Carnegie, as well as John D. Rockefeller, who's another significant philanthropist at the time who made his money in oil, whatever their intentions, they were often met with criticism. In fact, when John D. Rockefeller wanted to create a foundation, the US Congress was deeply critical of the idea of allowing such an organization to even exist. And there were public debates about actually making philanthropic foundations illegal. And I think it's important to remember that this was sort of a novel thing at the time, but it goes to show that there's a lot of concern about philanthropy at this time. And those concerns are multiple. A major one was a fear on behalf of the US government that philanthropists could use their immense private wealth to alter the world according to their preferences without any democratic process or accountability. If Andrew Carnegie decides he wants to support a particular cause, the American public can't vote or tell him to do something else instead, right? That is his discretion, and he has an immense amount of wealth, so he could potentially have a lot of influence. And this is a scary idea to a lot of Americans, especially in a democratic society where the aspiration is that all citizens should have some kind of equal standing or representation. And what philanthropy suggests is that, in fact, perhaps wealthy people will have greater influence than other citizens. But the way in which philanthropy responds to this criticism, I think, is really important. And you'll see that it's very different from how Silicon Valley thinks about philanthropy. But the way in which philanthropists of this era think about how do we meet the concerns of the public that philanthropy represents a threat to democracy is by directing much of their philanthropy towards building public and democratic institutions. This approach is what sociologists call contributive philanthropy. And the goal of these philanthropists was not to replace or challenge public services, but to actually create and build them up, and then hand those organizations off to the government to assume responsibility for. So the best example of this is the Carnegie libraries. Carnegie partnered with the public to fund the construction of thousands of libraries across the world, but he required the local government to use public tax dollars to staff, stock, and maintain the libraries in order to receive his contribution. So his goal with these public libraries was actually to try and involve the public in their creation and then guarantee, as a condition of his gift, that they remain free and accessible and tax supported into the future. As he said, this is not charity, it is the people helping themselves by taxing themselves. This is what a later set of philanthropy professionals in the 1950s described as the doctrine of discontinuity, which is a mouthful, but essentially what it means is that many philanthropists were fearful that the public could become reliant on their contributions, reliant on private donors and wealthy people, when what is better is for the public to continue operating projects and exercising responsibility for them on their own terms into the future. So there's many cases of this, but the idea here is that philanthropists are trying to seed or help the public create projects, and then hand them off and step away. So there's a sort of obsolescence built into this sort of early form of philanthropy where the donor is supposed to have very limited engagement in these philanthropic projects. They seed and then they step away, and these projects are taken up by the government or some other public institution. So that's sort of the kind of early, it's a snapshot of the sort of early philanthropy, and you'll see that's quite different from how Silicon Valley practices giving. And there's a lot that occurs in the history of philanthropy between, the 1890s, 1900s to the end of the century, which is where we're going to race ahead. But for most of the last century, if you wanted to study philanthropy or you wanted to meet a philanthropist in the United States, you would probably go to New York City, you'd probably go to Detroit, you could probably find the biggest foundations and the largest donors all probably, on the same block in Manhattan somewhere, which is to say there's very few philanthropists and foundations in the United States for most of the century, and they're all very geographically clustered where the sort of factories and industries which made their wealth were originally located. What happens, though, by the end of the century is that wealth starts to shift westwards. And one endpoint of that migration was Silicon Valley. And this was an area that up until the 1970s was really, just a region of farms and fruit orchards, but with a lot of government support, it quickly became this kind of center of high-tech companies and funders with innovative methods of financing startups. And by the 1970s, the region actually earned its name as Silicon Valley because silicon is used in all the sort of microprocessors that allow the region to create smaller and smaller computers. And throughout that decade, that is from the 1970s on, this small region, the San Francisco Bay Area, becomes wildly successful, and a variety of companies rise to dizzying levels of success, including just in the 1970s, Apple, Intel, and many others that might be familiar to you. Yet, what is really interesting about the case of Silicon Valley is that even though the region continues to accumulate a lot of wealth from the 1970s to the 2000s, it does not have much of a reputation for philanthropy. So here's an image from a popular magazine from 1992, which actually likens Silicon Valley to this fictional character, Ebenezer Scrooge, who's well known for being extremely selfish and not actually parting with the money that he has in great excess to help other people. And this is actually a recurrent criticism of Silicon Valley from the 1970s into the 2000s, which is that Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are not interested in philanthropy, presumably because they are uncaring or selfish or greedy or so on. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think it's worth noting that this region does not have much of a reputation for philanthropy, which is kind of a puzzling reality, and suggests that just because a region has a lot of wealth doesn't mean philanthropy is inevitably going to follow. And I think we'll get into this a bit more, but the reality is that the circumstances of this high-tech region are very different from those of Carnegie and Rockefeller, and the expectations and practices associated with philanthropy up until this point weren't really aligned with how people in Silicon Valley were thinking about what it meant to do good. So it's not that they're necessarily selfish or greedy, but it's that they have a very different way of thinking about what it means to do good that does not match up with how people are thinking about philanthropy. And we'll get into that a bit more here. So what do I mean by this? So one of the kind of predominant ways in which people think about philanthropy in the United States, and this is still true, and it was true then, is that philanthropy occurs within a particular stage in one's life. It is something that you do when you are done earning money, right? So Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, even the sort of more well-known early philanthropists in Silicon Valley, such as William Hewlett and David Packard, did not dedicate a significant part of their wealth to philanthropic causes until relatively late in life. And this is still largely true today. So only about 1% of ultra high net worth philanthropists are under 40 years old, and while 12.6% are over 80. And the average age of an ultra high net worth philanthropist is 65. So this is the extremely wealthy philanthropist. The average age is 65. But the challenge in Silicon Valley is, for a variety of reasons related to the way in which startups are financed after the 1970s, to a lot of other reasons that we don't need to go into, is that entrepreneurs are making lots of money at really young ages. So, for example, Steve Jobs, who's pictured here, who co-founded Apple, became a millionaire at 23, which was a significant amount of money in the late 1970s. But he did not want to step away from his business to engage in philanthropic pursuits, which, again, the expectation is that philanthropy describes a separate later stage of your life. But this is a young person, like many other entrepreneurs, who wants to remain engaged in his business. So this is one obstacle to cultivating philanthropy, but there are a few others that I want to touch on before I proceed. Another is a perception that you also still hear very frequently, which is that doing philanthropy well is actually harder than running a business, or that doing philanthropy well is harder than earning money. This is a sentiment that I have seen Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jack Ma, Jeff Bezos also make. And it's not obvious to me why that should be the case, but I think there's many reasons for why people might make this claim. But a major one that I think is especially relevant for Silicon Valley is that it's really hard to know whether you as a donor are actually accomplishing your goals in philanthropy. I don't know if that is sort of a familiar challenge for anyone here, but philanthropy, unlike business, lacks a lot of accountability. Philanthropists do not have customers. They don't have shareholders. So that means they don't have people who are going to tell them very quickly when they're performing poorly. You know, if you do badly by your customers or shareholders, your profit's going to fall really rapidly, right? But there's no similar mechanism in philanthropy. Instead, what philanthropists do is grant money to nonprofit organizations who are in turn pursuing goals that are, you know, often very massive and very sometimes vague, such as the reduction of homelessness or the improvement of the arts. And those goals often resist easy measurement and may take many years or decades to actually be achieved. And even if they are achieved, it's often difficult to know whether the intervention you funded as a funder, as a philanthropist, actually contributed to that goal. And added to all this, and this is something Steve Jobs actually shared in an interview in 1983, many people are not transparent with philanthropists. I don't know if this is, again, another familiar situation that you have all been in, but if you tell people, or they know that you are a philanthropist, you are suddenly going to be regarded as, you know, the funniest, smartest, most handsome person in the world, and no one will ever tell you that anything you're doing is incorrect, which is not great if you want to learn how to improve in your philanthropy, right? So as Steve Jobs told his interviewer, the problem with most philanthropy is that there's no measurement system. You give some money to do something, and most of the time you can never really measure whether you failed or succeeded. So it's really hard to get better, right? So there's this absence of a kind of ability to know whether you actually achieved outcomes in philanthropy. That's another deterrent to philanthropy in Silicon Valley. And the last I'm going to touch on is the reality that many people in Silicon Valley from the 1970s and even arguably earlier share, is that the business of creating technology actually has a lot of social benefit to it already, and may in fact be philanthropic in some way, right? In fact, Steve Jobs, who doesn't have a public record of philanthropy, he is not known as a philanthropist. After he died, he was memorialized as the world's greatest philanthropist, even though he had never publicly or very rarely given money away, which is sort of confusing. But the argument is that because he chose not to dedicate his time to giving his wealth away, but instead towards leading a successful company that introduced, a variety of new technologies, such as, the iPhone and the iMac and some of the early personal computers, he actually did the world more good than he would have in philanthropy. And I could go into this a bit more, but I think it's worth noting that you can find this idea that business is a form of philanthropy in many places in the world. It's not a Silicon Valley specific idea, but Silicon Valley, it holds a lot of weight there for a variety of reasons, some of which include the geography of Silicon Valley. So Silicon Valley is located in the Bay Area, and historically that has meant that it's also been very close to a lot of countercultural and sort of avant-garde ideas, such as Berkeley and San Francisco, where there's a lot of people who were thinking about, how do we create a world that is less governed by elites, that is less hierarchical, that is less conformist. And people like Steve Jobs and many of the sort of early technologists were part of that culture and drew on it when they were thinking about their technology. There's a real conviction amongst many Silicon Valley entrepreneurs going back to the 70s that the technology they're producing is revolutionary and is allowing people to be more independent and self-reliant and less dependent on elites or major corporations or government, which again is not an idea that aligns very well with philanthropy, because philanthropy historically has often been associated with elites and has often been associated with hierarchy, as the philanthropist has to give money to a beneficiary. That is an unequal relationship. It's not one that immediately appeals to the sort of Silicon Valley culture of wanting to create a more equal society where people have freedom to express themselves and not be under the sort of authority of other people. Now, I should say, though, there's many other reasons for why there's not this kind of active culture of philanthropy in the region, despite its great wealth. But by the 2000s, we see a real concerted effort to bring philanthropy to this region. And these individuals include financial advisors, politicians, attorneys, a handful of entrepreneurs, and people like Peter Hero, who is pictured here, who leads one of the local community foundations. And what they believe is not that Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are necessarily selfish or greedy or just amoral people, but sorry, my cat decided to interrupt me at that moment. But that, in fact, the older ways of thinking about philanthropy just don't align with how Silicon Valley entrepreneurs think about doing good. And so the task for this group of people is really to think about how can we reboot or transform philanthropy for this new generation. And there's many reasons for why there's a renewed interest in doing this kind of work by the 1990s and 2000s. one of which is that Silicon Valley undergoes a really massive growth in personal corporate wealth, which has a lot to do with the rise of dot-com internet-based companies. There's also, in this time in the United States, a really severe decline in trust in government. I won't go into all the reasons for why that is, but the important point here is to note that many Americans are less confident that the government can meet their needs and more open to the idea that perhaps entrepreneurs and market-based alternatives have more promise for meeting their needs. And one of the core ideas of this group of facilitators was that Silicon Valley's elites were never going to give money away if you scolded them into doing philanthropy. Instead, what they believed is that you needed to incentivize entrepreneurs into giving by assuring them that philanthropy could achieve the innovative and demonstrable benefits for the world that aligned with the donor's own interests. So put another way, Hero and these other facilitators believed that donors were more likely to give if they were allowed to define their goals and felt confident that nonprofits could convincingly claim and demonstrate their ability to meet those goals. And this might seem somewhat obvious, but it's an idea that stands in contrast with the claims that long animated demands for philanthropy, such as the argument that people should give because they have a moral duty or obligation. This is what nonprofits in the Bay Area had often demanded of entrepreneurs. They would argue that people in Silicon Valley were wealthy, and because they were wealthy, they had a responsibility, a moral duty to support people in need and to support the organizations doing charitable work in the region. But what these facilitators argue, as Peter Hero himself said in 2000, was, quote, entrepreneurs were not swayed by the idea that because you're rich and they're poor, you have to give your money away. They instead wanted to fund the change that they cared about. This means in practice that Hero and these other facilitators are working hard to try and conduct due diligence for donors. They're trying to find effective organizations, as well as help donors conduct evaluations of the impact of different philanthropic interventions. This is where we see a real rise in the demand for data about what nonprofits actually achieve, which can demonstrate what kind of measurable difference they're making. And I should say, that I know a lot of you ask questions about metrics and kind of the challenges of actually demonstrating measurable impact. And I definitely agree, it is a challenge. And I should say that the demand for measurable impact is not something that originates with Silicon Valley. It's actually really old. Some of the largest, most professional foundations have always sought to define their goals, determine reasonable strategies for pursuing them and monitoring progress to assess how well they're doing. But what's really significant about this era and the era that we all live in is that funders, especially in Silicon Valley, are becoming much more proactive about defining the specific outcomes that they want to achieve, identifying, their preferred approaches, and are much more willing to spend the time to identify grantees who can implement those approaches. And instead of, merely thinking about, what did I achieve in retrospect? I've given my money away. What did that all achieve? What Silicon Valley donors are increasingly doing by the 1990s is predefining the kind of outcomes they want to achieve and using those outcomes to actually benchmark the performance of their grantees. They're holding them accountable along the way to those outcomes. And this has a really profound consequence on philanthropy and the social sector more broadly, because this impulse towards really demanding much more measurable data about not only what did you achieve after you did all your work, but what are you achieving now towards that goal, tends to mean that what gets measured gets more money, right? What is measurable gets more money. And there are critics who would argue, and they did even in the 1990s, that much more messier and potentially, depending on your perspective, more important causes such as social movement advocacy, which is really messy and hard to measure, are underfunded precisely because there is a preference for funding organizations that have these kind of demonstrable, measurable impacts. And I think I'd also add that something that's really significant about this turn towards, thinking that philanthropy requires this rigorous, measurable data on impact is that there's a lot of different ways in which we could think about the purpose of that data. We could think about impact data as a way to prove that philanthropy is doing something beneficial to the public. But what's occurring more often and what remains true is that donors are demanding data from grantees to prove that those grantees are achieving the goals that donors care about. In other words, they're using impact data to assess whether nonprofits and grantees are meeting the hopefully shared goals of funders and nonprofits, rather than thinking about, collecting data to prove to the larger public that philanthropy is doing something worthwhile. I can get into that a bit more, but I also want to flag a few other trends that become much more characteristic of Silicon Valley philanthropy. One of these is actually evading, it's actually related to the earlier point, evading a lot of accountability to the public. So in the United States, there's very few rules that regulate philanthropy, but one of the hallmarks of Silicon Valley philanthropy was to find a way to work around those rules. Those rules were designed to ensure, or rather assure, the public that philanthropy served a public benefit. And they included requirements that, for example, philanthropic foundations publish financial information so that the public knows or has some idea of what they're doing. It also means that foundations have limitations on the kind of policy advocacy they can engage in. There's limitations preventing philanthropic organizations from practices that would allow donors to enrich themselves or their businesses. And significantly, there are and has been a longstanding requirement that foundations allocate a fixed amount of their assets every year to charitable purposes. And what this young generation of Silicon Valley philanthropists do in the 1990s is find ways to work outside of those regulations by not using foundations or even nonprofits for doing their philanthropy, which are the types of organizations that are subject to those regulations. And many attorneys and financial managers are helping them accomplish this goal. The rarer example of this is the use of limited liability companies, or LLCs, for philanthropic purposes. I won't go into all the details, but an LLC is a legal structure designed for commercial activity. And an LLC does not give a donor any of the benefits of creating a philanthropic foundation. You do not get any tax advantages as a donor for giving your money to an LLC. And you might wonder, well, then why would they actually want to use an LLC? And the reason is because if you give money to an LLC, you are not beholden to the restrictions that face philanthropic foundations. The donors who use an LLC can still give to nonprofits. They can still make charitable contributions, but they can also make profitable investments in for-profit endeavors. They can engage in direct political advocacy and lobbying. They can freely move money around between their businesses, and they do not have to report on their charitable activities or meet annual payout requirements like a foundation does. Pierre Omidyar, who co-founded eBay, was one of the pioneers of using the LLC for philanthropic purposes in 2004 with the Omidyar Network. And what he argued was that by using LLC, he's effectively allowed much greater potential in terms of the impact he can achieve, because he's not limited in terms of where he can allocate his money. There are businesses, he believes, who are doing socially beneficial work, and he should be allowed to fund them freely and even make a profit off of it. So one of the examples that he was really interested in was microfinance, which provides low interest loans to help people engage in entrepreneurial activity. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the Emerson Collective are additional instances of Silicon Valley donors using LLCs. But a far more common sort of innovation or form of philanthropy in Silicon Valley is the donor advised fund, or DAF. The easiest way to think of a DAF, if you're not already familiar, is that it's sort of a charitable savings account. So a donor puts money into the donor advised fund, and they get an immediate full tax deduction, essentially a tax reward, as if they had given money directly to a charity doing good work. However, and this is the sort of crucial point, unlike a traditional foundation, which must pay out a certain percentage each year, the money in a DAF has no distribution deadline. You do not have to give the money away at any particular point. It can simply sit there. And for a tech donor, this might be ideal because you can set aside money while deferring a decision about where it should go, ideally giving you an opportunity to think more strategically about how to use that money. The problem is that in practice, a lot of money does end up sitting in DAFs and can do so indefinitely, while the organizations that offer these funds continue to collect administrative fees. And this raises a lot of controversy in Silicon Valley and continues to raise a lot of controversy elsewhere, but especially in Silicon Valley, because the Silicon Valley Community Foundation has become the largest such foundation in terms of assets in the United States, because it offers these types of donor advised funds. It holds some $15 billion, at least in 2023. But many local nonprofits in the area, and this is increasingly less true, but it used to be true, argued that the foundation really did not push or encourage donors to actually use those funds. And instead, they sort of stayed there. The former co-director of the organization I'm working at actually did an experiment where they provided the minimum amount to open a donor advised account, which was $5,000, and then watched where the money went, only to learn that the value of his account the value of his account declined after 1 year, but had never gone to any charitable organization, and the foundation had never reached out to advise him or tell him how he could use that fund, despite collecting hefty fees for simply holding it. And this raises a lot of serious questions about the meaning of philanthropy. For example, when does philanthropy occur? Should we say and reward people for simply putting money into an account if it doesn't actually go to a charitable purpose, as if they did practice philanthropy? These are sort of ongoing questions. Another innovation that I'll flag that became characteristic of Silicon Valley philanthropy and was really important for cultivating a commitment to giving was a concerted effort to try and reduce barriers to entry for people who might start practicing philanthropy. So one of the innovations or practices that he pursued was actually placing philanthropic advisors inside tech companies who could answer questions about philanthropy and help people working in those companies start giving. He also innovated a practice where he allowed entrepreneurs to hire members of his team who might specialize in the funder's goals without having to deal with all the sort of administrative burdens of setting up some kind of organization. They could sort of use the staff that he had already trained on a case-by-case basis. And some of there's actually some pretty large foundations in Silicon Valley that use this service recurrently. So the Skull Foundation, which is really strongly associated with social entrepreneurship, is one such example. But again, sort of reducing the cost, the sort of paperwork, the administrative burden of actually starting to engage in philanthropy. And then finally, another that is overlooked, but I think is actually quite crucial, is the creation of communities of entrepreneurs and other people who are engaged or interested in giving, in which people could learn about philanthropy and social problems together. One such example is the Silicon Venture Fund, or SV2. This organization gathered together donors in Silicon Valley, and the staff would help those donors locate and be introduced to local nonprofits and other social entrepreneurs, and enable donors to not only meet and talk about and learn about social problems, but pool their funds collectively in an account and distribute them in service of their shared goals. This is an example of a collaborative fund, which is increasingly much more common in the United States, but also, I believe, even more common in parts of Asia, especially India. But what's really important about it for Silicon Valley is that there's lots of research that indicate that entrepreneurs and other very wealthy people do not want to talk to philanthropic advisors or financial managers to learn about how to do philanthropy. They want to instead learn from other entrepreneurs. And the reasons for that are varied. There's a suspicion that people who are professionals, such as working at a bank or at a foundation, are going to tell entrepreneurs how to give, which is not ideal when you think about philanthropy as being the sort of like deeply personal exercise. You don't want some expert coming and telling you how to give. But also, more common reality is that what donors encounter when they go and talk to professionals in philanthropy is someone who just offers them a lot of tax advice and does not actually sit with them and think about, what kind of world do you want to create? What matters to you? Whereas they can actually have more of those kinds of encounters with their colleagues and with other entrepreneurs. So this is important in Silicon Valley for one additional reason. And I thought this was kind of fascinating. So I'll share it with all of you because I think it might be relevant elsewhere. One of the enablers of philanthropic behavior is feeling that you have a connection to a wide range of other people. And for a lot of the sort of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, that's not always very easy to experience because, you're working all the time and you're driving on the freeway to go to your corporate campus, and you don't necessarily have kind of wide or diverse array of social contacts. But what SV2 and these other kind of collaboratives offer is an opportunity for entrepreneurs to develop these connections outside of the sort of familiar and realize that their well-being might depend on the well-being of other people who are quite unlike themselves. And this has been this idea, which is called associational capital, has been often linked to increases in philanthropic behavior. I will note before we kind of close, because I want to have time for us to have some questions, that one other kind of big change that occurs that's characteristic of Silicon Valley philanthropy is a real challenge about that earlier point I made about time and when philanthropy should occur. We've already kind of seen that a bit, right? When advisors are being installed within companies, and donor advised funds are allowing philanthropists to sort of hold on to their money and give when they please. But another change that occurs is advanced by entrepreneurs such as Mark Zuckerberg, who co-founded Facebook, now Meta, among others, which is that the argument they make is that youth is actually an asset. It's a benefit for giving well. It makes people better givers because they are more removed from tradition or from sort of traditional way of thinking about how to give or how to resolve problems, and therefore more likely to see new possibilities for change. And with the help of their advisors, they circulate these ideas to places like SV2 and try and get other people on board with this idea. And really core to it, and this this is sort of a double-edged sword that we'll learn about in a moment. Core to this idea for people like Zuckerberg is that if you start philanthropy fast and when you're young, you can make a lot more mistakes and learn from them and ultimately get better at doing philanthropy. And this is really wild from an American perspective, because philanthropy has never really historically been known to openly court the idea of failing. But what Zuckerberg and his entrepreneurs are saying is actually failing is great, and we should try and fail, because, you know, if we move fast and break things, as the slogan of Facebook is, we will learn how to improve and overcome problems quicker too. And all these ideas sort of culminate into a form of philanthropy that sociologists call disruptive philanthropy. And this disruptive philanthropy is defined by a few features that echo some of what we've already described. One is that the disruptive philanthropists of Silicon Valley want to shape public opinion about social problems, and they want to champion their kind of preferred method for solving them, while avoiding a lot of sort of public deliberation or input. And there is also a kind of strong conviction amongst Silicon Valley donors that competition is a really valuable way for forcing organizations to become more efficient, and should be a sort of goal of philanthropic endeavors. And finally, there's a third element, which is that a lot of disruptive philanthropists favor creating new private startup organizations over fixing or supplementing existing systems. And a good example of this, which distills all these ideas, is Mark Zuckerberg's gift to reform schools in Newark, New Jersey in 2010. This was a massive philanthropic project. He donated $100 million. And the idea was that, you know, these schools were really struggling, or literally falling apart. And what Zuckerberg proposed was creating, in part, private alternatives to the public school, independent charter schools, which would, he hoped, compete with the school and thereby compel these public schools that were already struggling to perform better. He also worked very closely with a lot of consultants and experts to implement these programs, but did not actually talk to local residents or teachers or students about the sort of project that he was thinking about. In fact, the schools that he was going to work with actually first learned about his big project on a talk show with Oprah Winfrey. So he's not going out into public and actually debating or thinking about getting public input as he's developing this project. And there's also a kind of privileging in this project of sort of measurable outcomes, which again is sort of something we talked about earlier, but one of the interventions that they implement is trying to improve the quality of education by rewarding and penalizing teachers based off of performance metrics, such as test scores. However, after all this project, you know, goes through, it doesn't really achieve its sort of grand ambitions. In fact, the results are pretty uneven. There's not a lot of improvement. But what is ultimately more alarming to the public and becomes a sort of lesson for Silicon Valley philanthropy is that in not listening to the people who were being affected by his decisions, Zuckerberg overlooked some really obvious remedies to the problems of low educational achievement. Students and teachers often felt really frustrated, in fact, that he and the various consultants that he hired did not talk to them, because a more urgent issue for them was the fact that they had very poor living standards. Many students and teachers lived in poverty, did not have great economic opportunities, and felt that those were more important considerations affecting their ability to succeed in education than the sort of test scores and privatized educational alternatives that Zuckerberg was proposing. And I think this example also illustrates that kind of double-edged quality of the idea that failure is ultimately valuable. That is an idea that makes a lot of sense in software, where you're constantly reiterating, you want to create a new version, test it out, see where the problems are, then test another. But in the world of philanthropy, if you fail, it has really severe consequences for people. So in this case, disrupted the lives of students and teachers, arguably impaired the educational opportunities of some students, and alienated a lot of people, and destabilized some pretty fragile systems. And in the end, Zuckerberg, however, could just sort of disappear, right, and leave this community to deal with the consequences without providing necessarily some kind of long-term alternative. This is quite different than that kind of contributive philanthropy that we described with Rockefeller and Carnegie, right? Now, I will say for his part, Zuckerberg did know that he had failed, and I do think that is another kind of characteristic feature of Silicon Valley philanthropists, more ready willingness to acknowledge that they may be messed up. And he has done some really interesting work since in trying to do more participatory modes of philanthropy, including having grantees inform some of the work that he does in the Bay Area. But the Newark example, his failed school experiment, did stir a lot of suspicion amongst the American public that perhaps letting wealthy people in Silicon Valley implement their sort of ambitious visions for social change was really costly and maybe not worth tolerating. And this also aligned, unfortunately, with news that a lot of the educational reforms that Bill Gates had sought were also suffered similar problems of not really listening to people on the ground and failing with, in those cases, probably more negative consequences. And on top of all this, by 2016, Silicon Valley is racked with a lot of scandals and controversies, including social media companies' abuse of personal data, the promotion of misinformation, growing awareness of the sort of deliberative, addictive nature of a lot of technology produced by Silicon Valley companies, and so on, all of which together really undermines a lot of confidence that Silicon Valley actually does do a lot of good, either in its business or in its philanthropy. And in fact, there are some philanthropists who are sensitive to these criticisms and start implementing sort of promotion of policy to try and regulate tech companies and try and implement more sort of restrictions on how they use data. So some examples include Dustin Moskowitz and Carrie Tuna, who are, they were friends of Mark Zuckerberg, but become really interested in promoting policy and research related to artificial intelligence and thinking about some of its dangers, as well as research on the sort of dangerous consequences of social media. Now I'm kind of wrapping here, but the consequences of all this have been multiple. One of the sort of consequences of the criticism of Silicon Valley technology companies and philanthropy has been that some elites in Silicon Valley have actually pulled away from philanthropy altogether and describe philanthropy as actually sort of an impairment to the type of good they want to do in the world. In their view, philanthropy is not just sort of unnecessary or ineffectual, it's also actively harmful because it's distracting entrepreneurs from the sort of real work of innovation, or if it's doing like what Carrie Tuna and Dustin Moskowitz are doing, if philanthropy is funding causes like ethical oversight of technology companies or criticism of tech companies or advocating for regulation, those philanthropists are perceived to actually be slowing down technological progress. And these ideas reflect a really deep-seated belief that complex social problems don't require philanthropy, but they can be solved through technology and they can be solved through market mechanisms. And this is sort of a perspective that's advanced most forcefully and recurrently now by Mark Andreessen and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. Mark Andreessen has really taken particular aim at philanthropists for supporting causes, slowing down or investigating the potential harmful consequences of artificial intelligence, which is an industry where he has invested a considerable amount of his money and which he believes will unlock human potential and have immense benefits, and believes that, in fact, these philanthropists are, as he describes, committing murder by slowing down the sort of advent of AI innovations. And some others in this group, like Elon Musk, I'll just quickly mention, they do practice philanthropy, but it's hard to know whether one should call it philanthropy. Musk himself, describes Tesla and SpaceX as philanthropic, but he does have a foundation as well. And a lot of the giving from his foundation seems really self-serving. So, he contributed to building a school for his children and for all the Tesla executives. He used the foundation to boost his image after there was a kind of rocket disaster that scattered debris all over a town. He has failed to sort of meet the minimum regulatory requirements for his foundation on numerous occasions. And if you go and you try and check out the website on his foundation, it's basically like one unformatted web page that barely tells you anything about what it's doing. So there's a real sort of low opinion amongst philanthropy in this group, unless it is actively supporting the sort of profitability or wealth accumulation of tech companies, which are perceived as doing lots of wonderful work. And the sort of weirdest idea proposed by this group, which is related to everything we've talked about, is this idea that philanthropists should be trying to create private cities and nations that are removed from sort of legal jurisdiction of existing nation states. So here in Silicon Valley, there are people who are trying to create privatized cities that aren't really subject to the laws of the United States and are free from the interference of democratic rules and taxation, and environmental regulations and labor laws. And I think in some ways this really represents a sort of ultimate form of a sort of extremely donor-defined, donor-centric form of impact, where the goal is the creation of an entirely private, governed reality where entrepreneurs can sort of act on their own vision of the good without any kind of public input or interference. However, thankfully, there's one other sort of idea that has come out of the Bay Area in response to some of these recent controversies, and this is where I'll bring it to a close. But this idea is called trust-based philanthropy. And this idea gained a lot of prominence during the pandemic, but remains very popular now. Comes out of San Francisco, and its approach to philanthropy that in many ways is meant to be a sort of response to the worst examples of philanthropy in Silicon Valley. Those who identify as trust-based philanthropists argue that funders need to acknowledge that they actually lack all the answers, that maybe the outcomes they think are important aren't actually as important, that in fact what matters most in a lot of social change work cannot be readily measured, and there's something valuable about having a more equal relationship with your grantees that's not sort of mediated by these constant and recurrent demands for near-term quantifiable impact. So some of the people who are associated with this movement include Pia Infante and John Esterly, who are pictured here. Those names are probably unfamiliar to you. The one who's more commonly associated with trust-based philanthropy is Mackenzie Scott, who helped create Amazon. But I think another aspect that's significant about trust-based philanthropy that addresses a sort of maybe a flaw or misgiving, I don't know what I would describe it, a flaw maybe in Silicon Valley philanthropy, is a focus on human connection. There's a lot of focus in trust-based philanthropy on talking to grantees, on being available to answer the phone and support them, and learning through conversation about what your shared vision for social change is. And, some argue, in fact, that trust-based philanthropy is really an attempt to try and bring the heart back to philanthropy, which for many centuries has been sort of like put into a box. And what philanthropists have argued and said is that the brain needs to dictate all our decisions. We need to be extremely analytical. But for some, there is a concern that perhaps this push to focus so much on measurement, on impact, has made philanthropy really impersonal and inhumane. So trust-based philanthropy is perhaps trying to restore that humanity to philanthropy. Having said all that, I don't know where philanthropy is going to go next. I'd say that there's a lot of uncertainty in the region now about, how entrepreneurs should be practicing philanthropy, a lot of open debate, entrepreneurs are arguing with each other about who is and isn't a philanthropist, but it's kind of an exciting time too, to start thinking about, what could philanthropy morph into in the preceding decades. What I hope this sort of nocturnal late night talk has maybe surfaced for all of us is a few ideas. One is that philanthropy is really not an inevitable or natural occurrence. In the case of Silicon Valley, it did not just appear when people started making tons of money. It was shaped by a lot of factors, many of which we didn't even necessarily get to, which were grounded in sort of business experience of entrepreneurs, the kind of local circumstances that they encountered, as well as policy restrictions. And what really got me actually interested in the work of philanthropy is that the Silicon Valley case really shows that facilitators and intermediaries, such as Peter Hero and sort of other people who are working with donors, have a lot of potential influence on trying to make regions and people philanthropic. So in the case of our story, Peter Hero and others actually cultivated and helped strengthen a distinctive commitment to philanthropy, which, for better or for worse, had these sort of disruptive features, right, that made it quite distinct from older forms of philanthropy as they exist in the United States, but which were in many ways more aligned with the kind of ways in which Silicon Valley entrepreneurs themselves thought about doing good. And now we're living in a new period where there is an even larger number of these facilitators debating and trying to research new ideas for what philanthropy should look like. So if you have some ideas, now's the time to come out here and propose them. With that, I think I'll close, as I do want to ensure that we have lots of time for questions, but I hope that there was something in all of this that was new and perhaps exciting for all of you.
Well, thank you. We're actually receiving a lot of questions. And
oh, great.
I think your lecture was very insightful because it gave us a sense how the philosophical structure and the actions inside of Silicon Valley's actually developed. And through that, I think a lot of participants are thinking about the Korean context right now. So before jumping into the Q&As, I actually sent you a set of prior questions. So if you have any questions you would like to specifically highlight, we can touch on that, and then we can move on to live Q&As. If you don't have them, I'll definitely start with a question.
Yeah, I think I probably am always going to pick the easy questions that I can answer. So I think it's probably better that if anyone has a question that they're dying to ask me, I can't guarantee I'll be able to answer it, but I would prefer that.
Okay, great. So I think a first question that would be a good start is that since we learned about the philosophical difference, and now for the Q&As, I think it would be also great to hear about the criticisms and the failures that the Silicon Valley's philanthropy have. So the question would be, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing Silicon Valley philanthropy right now? Could you share an example of a project that failed or faced significant criticism, and what might we learn from that? So that's a question.
Yeah. I think that is, I mean, I think the Chan Zuckerberg initiative example, the Zuckerberg initiative in Newark, New Jersey, is certainly a telling example in that a core part of the failure was that Zuckerberg was very narrowly fixated on achieving the kind of enormous goal that he had set out for himself, which was very unlikely to ever be achieved, but which, if it was achieved, was going to have these enormous benefits. And that idea that philanthropy has to be sort of aimed at these big bets, which are, interventions that could have high potential benefits, but maybe have low or very uncertain probabilities of success, I think is actually really commendable. And I do really think that is an admirable part of Silicon Valley philanthropy. I think, everybody likes to say they're a risk taker, but historically philanthropy is not a risk-taking enterprise. And we can talk about what interventions might be available to actually push philanthropy in that direction. That's something we want to do. Mm-hmm. But I will say the failure of that initiative, in the sense that Silicon Valley philanthropists did not listen to the people who are going to be affected by their decisions, teachers and students, is a recurrent problem. And it's been a recurrent problem with philanthropy in the United States. But what I think has occurred since that sort of failure or sort of uneven initiative is actually there's a lot more interest now in the Bay Area and thinking about how do we include the voices of those who are on the ground, who will be affected by our decisions. How do we think about impact in a way that is not so donor defined, but is actually defined in partnership with the people we're trying to support? And for me, I think that's commendable, but I'm not necessarily convinced that people have thought as critically about those practices as they should be. I think that the sort of earlier efforts to try and measure what nonprofits achieve and try and rigorously measure that and use that data to prove that philanthropy actually has some kind of consequence has been pushed back against a lot more recently as being sort of overly demanding or elitist or technocratic. And there's been more of a sort of effort to try and not demand that kind of information. And I worry that that is a mistake if it's pushed too far, because philanthropy is an institution that in the United States and elsewhere is very fragile. And if it can't prove that it doesn't do something of value, I worry that more people will be open to the idea that we don't really need it anymore. And in fact, in the United States, one of the kind of, you asked me, like, what are the challenges that Silicon Valley philanthropists confront? The current administration, whatever you think of its politics, has actually been much more critical of the value of philanthropy and has actually tried to impose restrictions on foundations. And just the prospect that the federal government could do such a thing has actually prevented even some of these really massive foundations, like the Gates Foundation, which is, I mean, I don't even know how many people it employs, 300 plus, and it's one of the largest foundations in the world, actually limited its grants and redirected what it was doing just out of fear that the government would act and penalize it because it was funding grant areas that the Trump administration deemed controversial. And so I think that, we need to think more critically about how philanthropy can demonstrate to the public and not just to donors or to grantees that it is a sort of valuable exercise and one that we want to preserve and understand more deeply. I realize it's a little convoluted, but I think maybe another way of clarifying what I'm trying to say is I think a lot of the trust-based philanthropy and sort of other sort of efforts to improve philanthropy focus too much on the relationship between funders and those that they support and not enough on thinking about philanthropy and its relationship to the broader public, which, if they so decide, can vote for people who can implement policies that would be very consequential for philanthropy. And I think finally, I think there's another kind of development that you had mentioned at the outset that I didn't get to talk about, which is this kind of trend towards participatory philanthropy, which has pretty old roots in Silicon Valley, or rather San Francisco Bay Area, in which grantees are given discretion to actually make funding decisions or be sort of placed into a position of authority over the philanthropic process that would otherwise be held by the donor themselves. And I think that's really, creative and interesting. It has not taken that much of a hold of Silicon Valley, but even that mode of philanthropy as a sort of effort to improve philanthropy, I think raises a lot of concerns for me. I worry that, philanthropists need to think more critically about who they're including in the participatory process, how are they defining the communities they want to help. And we can talk a lot more about that, but I think for me, I'm uncertain about the sort of remedies that have been offered to philanthropy now, and am much more interested in thinking about what policies might be implemented to improve philanthropic practice, rather than what donors might voluntarily do themselves to try and improve philanthropy. But that is I think all over the place. So I apologize. I'm definitely feeling the sleepiness here, but I'm happy to try and answer any other questions you might have.
Yeah, sure. Actually, we had several questions which were related to the answers, such as should we how should we measure impact? How can people define what lasting impact is? Because in Korea, we also have a strong requirement about short-term impact, and also which might be easily made to quantitative outputs. So let's move to another question. Yeah, I think this will be interesting. So you spoke about the contributions of foundations established by entrepreneurs in the United States, particularly the philanthropy of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. I'm curious about the public perception regarding the social impact of old money foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation versus the new money, which is the Silicon Valley in the United States.
That's an interesting question. I let me think about it too, and because I also want to actually respond to some of the additional questions you'd flagged really briefly by noting that if you were thinking about how to understand impact in a way that might actually be beneficial for democratic societies, I would really recommend that you look up the work of a colleague of mine named Aaron Horvath, who has written a lot about evaluation impact. But one of the things he's particularly concerned about is that a lot of the ways in which we assess impact in the United States it's definitely very quantified, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but a lot of the ways in which people now try and identify promising organizations, it's almost like shopping for a new pair of shoes, where you go on the web and you look at the different reviews, and you don't really engage with anybody, sort of take for granted whatever the sort of rating agency tells you, and there's not a lot of information it actually gives you. And he's proposed sort of alternative ideas for how, the kind of rating agencies and attempts to assess impact could be implemented. So if you don't have his name, I'm happy to email it to you if anyone's interested in learning more about impact. I think he had a piece that was just published not too long ago in a magazine on the sort of civic consequences of fixating on impact as something that can be narrowly quantified. And his stuff is really cool, so I definitely recommend it. In terms of old philanthropy and the new, that's a really interesting question. I guess one thing that I think is kind of compelling is, you know, I guess to get sort of weird about all this, if you go back and think about the original sort of definition of philanthropy, it means love for humanity. And I think if you were to really take that seriously, what's kind of interesting when you think about philanthropy is that, what you're trying to do when you do philanthropy is try and support a particular vision of how humanity should exist. And I think when you go back in time and you look at the kind of philanthropy of Carnegie or Rockefeller, there is, I think, more a focus on enabling humanity to be really creative and self-determined to make its own choices about, how you would like to live your life or improve yourself. So again, the sort of classic example would be the Carnegie libraries, which I don't know if there were any built in Korea. I wouldn't be surprised if there were, but if you've ever been to one, there are these beautiful public spaces. And the idea was that anybody could come into them and engage with, the arts and, on their own accord. They could pick whatever books they wanted, spend their time however they wanted, and in that process enrich themselves, being in these beautiful spaces, reading beautiful literature. And to me, that seems like a really archaic idea, but sort of really interesting, especially because I think one of the kind of strands that has come out of Silicon Valley philanthropy, which we didn't talk about, is very much the opposite of that. So effective altruism, I don't know if anyone is familiar with this idea, but it's like sort of a philosophy within philanthropy. And if we were thinking about philanthropy as trying to support a particular vision of humanity, the effective altruists are trying to support a form of philanthropy or support a vision of humanity that's like just surviving. So a lot of their giving is oriented around, vaccinations, trying to maximally improve sort of human happiness and health. And they are very critical of wasting your money on the arts or on museums. And this is sort of like the maximum extreme of thinking about philanthropy as an exercise in achieving the greatest quantifiable impact that you can. And for effective altruists, they've taken that to a sort of utilitarian extreme where they will tell people you are being immoral if you are not funding causes that can actually save lives or, improve the well-being of humanity in terms of very physical sort of ways, right? And that to me is something commendable about it, but it's really just striking how different those two ways of thinking about the purpose of philanthropy are. And I guess I would like to see more people leaning more in the direction of that sort of Carnegie model of creating public spaces that allow people to think about new alternatives and not just survive but actually become maybe like an artistic creative person, or I don't know, just inhabit a place that's really beautiful and freely accessible. So I don't know if that really answered your question, because it's not so much about sort of long-term consequences, but yeah, I do think there are some sort of marked philosophical differences between the sort of periods. And I'm happy to follow up with you if you would like more recommendations for thinking about those comparisons.
Great. So I think we'll have to move to our last question. I thought this question is pretty creative, so I'll just introduce this to you. So in Korea's startup ecosystem, there is a pay-it-forward culture of contributing to other startups. But philanthropy still feels unfamiliar and lacks a strong sense of necessity. In this kind of environment, what do you think is important for establishing a foundation for philanthropy? So this would be our last question.
Sure. Yeah, I think related to the lecture, something that's really underfunded in the United States, I don't know how it fares elsewhere in the world, is people who actually study and work on philanthropy. It's strange, but the thing that gets probably funded the least of all the potential causes is is actually trying to understand and improve philanthropic practice. But I think, as you can see in the case of Silicon Valley, actually having people who are strongly committed to working with donors and trying to understand the sort of meaning of philanthropy and what animates people to give, and how also the motivations for giving can be very regionally specific, right? Like, I think that was one of the core insights of the facilitators of Silicon Valley philanthropy, was an understanding that you can't just have a universal solution. There's no sort of flat way to get everybody in the world to give. You have to develop sort of practices and modes of giving that are relevant and interesting to the ways in which people think about doing good, which can differ in many parts of the world, even within the same region. I mean, we didn't talk about this, but the way in which Silicon Valley philanthropy is thought about, or the way in which Silicon Valley is thought about philanthropy, is different than how San Francisco and its elite have thought about philanthropy. So I think for me, I would really love to see more people supporting and getting involved in actually studying philanthropy, and supporting philanthropic infrastructure. And there's a lot of ways in which that could be done. But I think if there's an opportunity in Korea, that might be one. So it's sort of a long way of answering your question, but perhaps there needs to be people who are better understanding the circumstances and needs of philanthropists in Korea.